Ni kitu gani nilichofanya ama kusema kukufanya wewe kuvunja ahadi ulionipa ya kuishi pamoja milele tukipendana? Na huko ulipo simu ikilia, wewe utumai iwe ni mimi nimekucharazia simu. Na usiku wa manane, wewe bado uniwaza tuwe pamoja tukipendana. Ewe Amina, wacha nikutobole siri. Ile picha yako bado iko kabambe ukutani wa chumba changu. Sauti yako bado imara chumbani kwangu. Hata wayo wako husikia kama ambaye unaninyemelea, ukitaka kuninong'onezea. Na huko ulipo simu ikilia, wewe uwaza na kutuma iwe ni mimi nimekucharazia simu. Na usiku wa manane, wewe bado uniwaza tuwe pamoja tukipendana milele. Huzuni na machozi na upweke juu ya penzi lako, hofu na kukerwa na roho juu ya penzi lako. Amina. Na huko ulipo simu ikilia, wewe uwaza na kutumai iwe ni mimi nimekucharazia simu. Na usiku wa manane, wewe bado uniwaza tuwe pamoja tukipendana mimi na wewe. Amina. Tuwe tukipendana milele mimi na wewe. Amina. Kidosho wangu. Amina. Tuwe tukipendana milele mimi na wewe. Amina. As usual, in Mazungumzo, I like to start with a piece of music, my own composition, Amina. I hope you enjoyed it. With the pandemic, we got to go to music, to lift our spirits. Because we got to wear a mask, keep distance, wash our hands constantly, and, keep safe until when we bring the pandemic down and land it. Now, this is your host, Dr. Gilbert Githere, coming to your home with another session of Mazungumzo. As usual, because of the times, because of the days, controversial days, 2020 and 2021, with Black Lives Matter, politics of race, as W.W. Du Bois said, the 21st century is a century of color line. People are going to be really sensitive about it. He foresaw it. He's being vindicated. Now, in order to understand, otherness, always, language game has got element of others. You and them. And always the philosophy of the day will downplay the other so that you yourself, you're uplifted, in status in society, both economically, geographically, culturally, and you're uplifted, and it seems as if as an individual, all benefits seem to be directed at you. Hegel is a philosopher I have tried to look at when I look at the Black Lives Matter. Hegel was kind of very, very particular about others. And he looked at Germans as, a super race. Remain to be corrected in that fact, but his writings, phenomenology of history especially, he plays down on the Africans. So to look at Hegel and the individual, the aspect of the individual and acquisition of consciousness is a very, very important element if you are to understand the fact of others, how the others develop in the Western philosophy. Because first of all, Hegel being so important and relevant, especially in the Western philosophy and thought, especially when it comes to theology and the spirituality of the West, he plays a very important role. Because actually, Hegel is the person you can pick in the West, although you can also attribute it to Immanuel Kant and Kierkegaard, that spirituality is so important, religion and absolute reality and absolute being the search for truth in the West is connected to spirituality and absolute reality, and at the end of it you get the supreme being there at the end of your knowledge acquisition. Hegel actually brings out that fact very clearly in his writing. In fact, Hegel opens his discussion in a phenomenology of spirit by actually, bringing it out clearly and stating it that actually spirit is the living thing in consciousness. All this time, what drives consciousness is spirit, the absolute being, absolute reality, the supreme being in the Western religion is what drives the spirit in Hegel's philosophy. The essence of life is that the acquisition of consciousness is a fact of spirituality. It manipulates consciousness. And the dialectics actually, thesis, antithesis, and thesis, hypothesis and thesis, they are all manipulated by spirit. And in the opening, he actually states that the acquisition of knowledge is perfected by human beings as they acquire knowledge through education and educating themselves as individuals. And especially when they become scientific, the knowledge becomes perfect. And the search for truth, as Hegel says, is perfected when science is thrown in. So an individual, and Hegel should be understood in this perspective. When you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, which you go to read slowly, line by line, and you go to finish it to understand that the individual's acquisition of consciousness is so important because it is a human being is born. It doesn't have much knowledge, but it has a perception. All the brain work is fully composed, ready to acquire knowledge. And knowledge is actually a variable of language. As a human being acquires knowledge, as a child, starts being educated by the parents, starts being educated by the brothers and the immediate family. And then acquisition of knowledge to the child becomes a communal responsibility. It becomes a societal responsibility, and it acquires all the values of its culture and milieu from the society around it. But before this happens, Hegel lets us know that the human being is completely involved in a very dynamic, dialectical situation in the mind of trying to define the self. The self-consciousness of an individual is very much also internal and external. And there is a big responsibility on an individual to try to prove that he is the person. And this is where ego comes in. Consciousness as it develops, self-consciousness, the human being is identifying himself or herself as the most important entity in life, in the environment. I am the one. And he becomes very possessive as he does this. Once he thinks, I am not an object, I think, I have values I consider important. And all this comes through senses, taste, speech, sight, hearing, and thinking, and emotional intelligence. All these things are language is at the center of gaining that consciousness of self. And as it gains self-consciousness of itself, there is a very big contradiction between itself, self-consciousness. Self-consciousness has both negative self-consciousness and positive self-consciousness, and they are always in conflict. So as the individual identifies himself and understands himself consciously, there is that conflict. The negative self-consciousness is facing the positive self-consciousness and is telling them, hey, don't put your ego above mine. There's that competition. Sometimes they call it sibling rivalry. But internally there's rivalry between those self-consciousness as they face one another. And every element of consciousness, as per universal law, there's a huge dialectical conflict. Things are just, there is this turmoil, disagreement and agreement. Because the individual, as he becomes himself and identifies himself, he's not an object, he's a thinking person. He wants hierarchy in life, in the society he's in. And he wants the highest point of responsibility. But at the same time, he's not an individual. He starts to realize there is community around him. So the individuality, although promoted in the West, is cut to size by self-consciousness of others. Now, that's where the struggle comes, because those who acquire in defining themselves as us and them becomes others. So here in Hegel's concept or thinking, or in the environment he was living in, the Germans became the hierarchy, the ones with the perfect knowledge, and they are the perfect human beings. And the others, like the Africans, as he said, they had never even invented a wheel. He looks down upon them. That's a discussion for another time, because now we are trying just to see how does others, defining others, come in Hegel. And we can see that Hegel struggles very much with that subject because language is the one which helps the human beings to actually define things. Like, for example, water is so essential in our life. And it is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. That's one entity of life that human beings discover is so important. And also in human beings, there are things which they know. Universal laws are there. Universal consciousness. If you see fire, don't put your finger in fire. Fire will burn you. As Osibisa sang, don't play with fire, fire will burn you. So individuals, as discussed by Hegel, after they have defined the self, they arrive at a point that they know, okay, we have defined ourselves. We are not objects, we are thinking entities. And there are things we require from the environment. We want food, we want shelter, we want clothing, we want luxury, we want food, and we want material for entertaining ourselves. Because human beings by nature are homoaestheticus, as Professor Ali Mazrui said in many of his writings. A human being loves beauty. And when he gets all those defined, existence, as Martin Heidegger put it, but Martin Heidegger did not consider consciousness as important as existence. Now, once the human being has defined himself as a most important entity, he starts to realize, or she starts to realize, there are shortcomings in his life or her life. They are not immortal. One time they will have to lose their lives. Now at this point, knowledge has accumulated through a perception, intuition, concepts, thinking, ideas, understanding, thinking, and knowledge starts to be acquired, and it goes through education and in pedagogy. The human becomes really a great thinker using sciences. E equal mc squared, Einstein's formula. He starts to explore quantum and nano theories. And now he becomes completely knowledgeable. And what makes human beings survive? The conscience, that inner voice between good and evil starts to set in, and the valuing of survival. But it can become so particularized that A senses its values are the most important, and it does not consider B. So the otherness sets in. But at the same time, the human being, once he realizes he's not immortal, he starts to look at something to define himself as his measure. And spirituality starts to be the measure. That although I am not mortal, I'm not immortal, sorry. There is this element which will see me through that problem. And the supreme being starts to creep into his life. That for me to be able to survive to the next life, Spirit will see me through that. I'll stop there. We are still exploring the subject. And this is your host, Dr. Gilbert Githere, saying ciao until we come again and expound on the problem of others, and especially through Hegel. Thank you.